are different states enforcing these types of COVID-19 restrictions. And then also Democrats are doing their level best to get rid of the death penalty across the country. How about that and some of the politics surrounding it? For answers and discussion, I am pleased to welcome to the show someone who's outside in Colorado. He is the district attorney for the 18th Judicial District in the state of Colorado, where I broadcast from, which is the largest judicial district in the state. George Brauchler joins us today. George, my friend, hello. How are you today?
I'm good, buddy. The sound is awfully low on my end. I don't know if you got a way to turn that up, but I'm happy to join you.
Thank you. I will. I see Nathan's hearing that, and he's doing what he can to up the volume for you. Again, George Brauchler, our guest. George, let me then, I'll simplify the questions. Let me know if the volume is better for you. But I'm curious overall your thoughts on the fact that so many of these states, including Colorado, now implementing serious restrictions in order to combat COVID-19. What do you make of it? Do you think it's appropriate?
Look, I've got my concerns. There's two things going on here. One, I'm a rule of law guy. As the district attorney for over 1 million Coloradans, to put that in perspective for the people joining you, in the United States, there's probably 34, 35 jurisdictions that have 1 million or more people in them. Some super huge, right? Like the boroughs in New York City or Los Angeles or Cook County. But for the West, in between the Mississippi and the Pacific coast, there aren't a ton, and we're in one. And so I take an oath to uphold and defend the laws of the state of Colorado. I am told that when the governor, under our Constitution and the statutes that are applicable, issues an emergency proclamation and declaration, and then issues orders after that, that those orders carry the force of law behind them. All that stuff is meaningful to me as someone who wants to uphold the rule of law, whether I agree with the law or I don't. Part of the problem, though, is these things are so foreign to us. We have not seen anything like this in my lifetime, that I begin to question whether or not there is a bigger constitutional right under the United States Constitution, perhaps the fourth or the fifth, maybe some others, that are implicated here by some of these orders. And I don't know when the last time we've tested some of these orders are. And what I don't want people to be confused about is this. It's not a question of, are these good ideas? I think undeniably they're good ideas. Social distancing and reducing down the number of businesses that create environments where there isn't social. I think all that stuff is great. The question is, can it be accomplished through the force of law, through the government forcing people to do it, or should this be through social pressure and cajoling and what your neighbors do? So that part, look, right now we're 4 or 5 days into this order. I'm going to continue to treat this like this is the law of the land. I'm going to encourage my neighbors. I'm going to encourage you, Jimmy, to follow the governor's and the Colorado Department of Physical Health and Environment's orders at this point. But make no mistake, we're looking into the constitutionality of this, because I just don't want to shrug and say, oh, well, it's written on paper, therefore It must be the law, and put everybody's liberties at risk.
George Brauchler, how are you seeing other district attorneys in Colorado and around the country enforcing these types of measures? Are you noticing concern among your peers similar to your concerns?
Well, yes and no. I mean, look, there's 22 elected judicial district attorneys in the state of Colorado, dividing up our 64 counties. And it's about 50-50 Republicans and Democrats. And simply being a Democrat doesn't describe it, because you have some pretty, in my opinion, conservative Democrats in Pueblo on the western slope. But then you also have Denver and Boulder, who are just far more liberally minded in that. As a group, because of that dynamic, we haven't had conversations about the constitutionality of it individually with different DAs. Yeah, we've shared texts and stuff about what are you doing and what are you seeing and what are your concerns. But as a group, we're just too politically divided. And I'll tell you, Jimmy, it's probably a separate show, but that is the growing problem with what we see in criminal justice, in my opinion. Between term limits and George Soros, we are seeing a politicization of prosecution like we've never seen in the history of the country. And it shows up when you talk about issues like this sometimes.
Now, in terms of enforcement, I know in Colorado there's a maximum penalty of $5,000 or 18 months in jail or both. I don't know how other states are addressing it as far as their enforcement levels and what have you. How likely do you think it is that someone, at least in Colorado, if not other parts of the country, would actually be prosecuted under the fullest extent that someone could be penalized for this?
Well, let's step back for a moment. First off, that fine and potential jail that you cited is true, but not for the governor's order, not for a state order. There is a separate section under the law that says when a local county or a health district, like for instance, I live in Douglas County, that's part of the Tri-County District. When they issue a health order, including a stay-at-home order, that order can be punishable like we would call a first-class misdemeanor, which is up to $5,000 or 18 months in jail. That is not true for the governor's orders. The governor's orders carry what we would call a second-class misdemeanor punishment of up to $1,000 or 1 year in jail. But neither of those things really addresses your question. The answer to which is, I think it is incredibly unlikely. The approach that I have taken, and I honestly don't know what other DAs have done, I just presume it's the same, is that I want to leave this pandemic, I want to leave this stay-at-home order, having had no person in my jurisdiction written a ticket, a summons, if you will, to come into criminal court on these things. These things should be the product of education by the public, education by media, pressure from your neighbors to do the right thing, just acting in the right way on your own. But at the end of the day, I don't want people to be afraid of government during these times to the point that they're concerned about calling for help or they're concerned about reporting a crime. That is not what we should be having with local law enforcement. And frankly, I want them out there doing bigger things. I don't want them running down people trying to find out if they're going to the store or they're going to a friend's house. I don't want law enforcement used that way. If you look at Hawaii, for instance, I looked at an article yesterday. Hawaii, I think, has summoned like 70 people and arrested another 12 under their orders. I don't want that to be Colorado. I certainly don't want it to be the 18th Judicial District. And as you can imagine, any ticket that's written, it's not going to be written into court next week, next month, probably 90 to 120 days out when this thing is in our rearview mirror, hopefully. And the question is, do we want to use the force of government against an individual for something like this, like a violation of this order? And without knowing the extreme details that might exist, and I suppose there could be. Look, there are jerks out there. There are people that are going to want to flaunt the law just to flaunt the law and put people at risk. I leave open the possibility that there's something like that. But, buddy, we're on day 5, like I said, and I don't think there's been a single summons written. In fact, I've put in place an agreement with my sheriffs and the chief of police for Aurora, which is the second largest police department in the state, that they won't scratch a single ticket without calling me first so that we can have that last talk. This is not how I want to use state authority.
We're talking with George Brauchler, Judicial District 18
Hey, for what it's worth
attorney.
too, Jimmy, the sound, not better. You sound a bit like a distant voice in my ear.
Okay. All right. Well, let me try to get a little closer to the mic as well and see if that helps you. George Brauchler, our guest for the 18th Judicial District in Colorado, one of, as he said, fewer than 40 jurisdictions around the country who has 1 million or more within their judicial district. Just a final question on this topic. It goes a little more locally, but I think it has broader implications. Governor Jared Polis of Colorado implemented this executive order stay-at-home decision by executive order, and he didn't notify district attorneys like yourself that he was going to be moving forward with this. What does that tell you about how he and maybe others right now are how they're approaching this as far as dismissing law enforcement officials and prosecutors who will actually have to enforce this?
It's bigger than just us, Jimmy. They didn't coordinate with anyone at local law enforcement, not the chiefs of police, not the sheriffs, not the prosecutors, all of whom would be called upon to enforce these orders. But you got to step back further than that. Since we had Bill Ritter, who was the former DA out of Denver, and he was the governor up until, 2010, since him, we've had 2 governors who have an incredible blind spot when it comes to criminal justice. And not just them, but the people that advise them. I don't know of a single person in the governor's inner circle who has a whiff of experience at all in criminal justice. And so it makes it easy, in my opinion, to muddle through almost every decision without trying to get input from that important part of government. So this was a huge surprise. Not that there would be an order, but the details of it. And let me tell you what that shows up like. Inside this order, the governor has adopted the Colorado Department of Physical Health and Environment, CDPHE's order, with all the details in it about who can go where, what businesses, what's essential, and all that stuff. Because they never ran it by someone who has ever been in the enforcement game, there is language, I think it's in paragraph F of the CDPHE order, that actually makes it a crime to shake hands, that makes it a crime not to wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. That's silly. That's ridiculous. That may be a great recommendation, and maybe the language could have been written as Coloradans are strongly encouraged to, but instead they wrote Coloradans shall. Once the governor utters those words and adopts that order, it becomes punishable by a $1,000 fine or a year in jail. Now, as you and I talked about, that ain't ever going to happen, right? But that's just silly. It's silly to have not coordinated with law enforcement. And a lot of people who I've pushed back on and said, hey, that is just amateur hour, have said, well, it's an emergency. He didn't have time to consent. Give me a break. This is a guy who found time to commute the sentences of 3 of the most notorious killers in the history of the state of Colorado. He certainly could have had time to send out a text or an email that says, hey, thinking about throwing out an order y'all might end up having to enforce. Thoughts? Question mark. I mean, he could have tweeted that out, but nothing like that.
George Brauchler, since you just mentioned what Governor Polis did last week as far as commuting death row sentences of 3 individuals, this is something that, getting rid of the death penalty, that we're seeing a lot of Democrats take up across the country. New Hampshire recently eliminated theirs. In fact, if we go to cut 1, hopefully you can hear this well enough, but this is Joe Biden. In cut 1, this is last summer of 2019, speaking to an audience in New Hampshire about the death penalty.
We should make sure, and I got 2 great judges in here, but we should make sure that if in fact someone is put on trial for a crime that could end up with a major sentence or life imprisonment because it was a capital offense, and by the way, congratulations to you all ending the death penalty.
He said, congratulations, you all, on ending the death penalty. We saw the Colorado State Legislature, before it went out of session, do exactly that, and the governor took those powers, Governor Jared Polis, to commute sentences of 3 individuals who were on death row for good reason without notifying families and what have you. Tell us about that and the broader implications. So what happened with Governor Polis and the broader implications nationally, in your view, George Brauchler?
There's so much about this that is just frustrating, Jimmy. First off, the legislature doing this the way they did it was absolutely gutless and disrespectful of the voters of the state of Colorado. Let me tell you why. And by the way, I put up my hood here so that I could cover up my little earpiece because it's a little windy where I'm at outside.
Wise move. Thank you.
Yeah. So I feel like I look like I'm getting ready to commit a crime. I'm not. I'm just covering up.
Go ahead. Do you know a good district attorney who might go leniently on you?
Yeah, I try to go incognito as much as I can. No, I'm kidding. So here's what's gutless about the way they passed the bill, but they passed it. And first off, everything falls under the caption, elections have consequences, right? In this particular case, the Democrats dominate every lever of state government. You knew this was coming. But what they did in passing this bill this year is they built in a safety clause safety clause into the bill. And for people that don't know what that means, in the state of Colorado, every bill that gets passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, there's a period of time under the Constitution where voters like us can petition to say, whoa, before that becomes effective, we want it to come to us, the voters. Now, keep in mind that the legislature could have referred this measure to the voters, but they knew what you and I know, and that is no state's voters in America have ever voted to repeal the death penalty. Let me say that again. No state's voters have ever voted to repeal the death penalty. Of the 22 states that have repealed it, it has all been by function of law, like some activist Supreme Court, or by the legislature. And I'll give you a couple of examples of why the Colorado legislature was absolutely horrified about getting voters the opportunity to vote on this. In 2016, Nebraska's legislature, unicameral, they voted to repeal the death penalty. The governor vetoed it. They overrode the governor's veto. The governor and a bunch of other people put it on the ballot, and guess what? It got back on the books. Here's another example. California, super conservative California in 2016 had 2 competing ballot measures. One was to end the death penalty. The other was to speed up the appellate process to kill someone after they've received the death penalty. California voted to keep the death penalty and to accelerate the time with which someone would be executed after they get the death penalty. So Colorado legislators were horrified. So not only would they not refer it to the ballot, they snuck in a safety clause that says this law has to become effective immediately upon the governor's signature. There's no time to allow voters to petition to stop it from taking effect because it's a matter of public health and safety. What? Are you kidding me? What straight-faced argument could you have that that had to take place? So sure enough, on the 13th of March, it gets sent to the governor's desk. Now, he has 10 days by law to sign it, and sure enough, on the 23rd, he signs it. Everyone knows he's going to do it. Once again, I called Hickenlooper the Ray Charles of criminal justice because it wasn't a blind spot. He just didn't know it was out there. This guy's worse. He knows it's out there, knows what he's doing, but his goal is to get as many people out of prison on the streets and away from major consequences of their evil conduct as possible. I mean, that's what he's done so far.
Well, and George Brauchler.
So this is the part, though, that's super nefarious.
Okay.
On that same day, with no heads up to us, not a single heads up to the prosecutor's office who owns all 3 death penalty cases, guys that were on death row right now. He commutes all their sentences. Didn't have to. There's no time requirement of it. Why on Monday, in the middle of the biggest pandemic in our memory? Some people might say that it was to bury that news in the news of the pandemic. And that's what it strikes me as, is this was a guy who knows this was a horribly controversial decision and decided, I'm just going to do a quickie press release. He doesn't talk to the media about it, just slips out a little 2-paragraph press release and then runs back to being the coronavirus governor.
George Brauchler, our guest, is the prosecutor for the Aurora theater shooting trial and was seeking death penalty. It didn't happen, but nevertheless pursued that, which I thought was good, especially because that is what the victims were wanting by and large. Unfortunate that it wasn't successful in that regard, but hey, the guy's behind bars for life. So you've dealt with these death penalty cases before in that particular instance, for example. So I want to broaden this out for just a moment before we let you go. George Brauchler, District Attorney for Colorado's 18th Judicial District. What does this tell you about what Democrats are trying to do nationally regarding the death penalty and also their lack of interest in coordinating with law enforcement, it seems?
Well, look, this has been taking place for a while now. What we are seeing, as I'd mentioned in the last segment, was this is the politicization of criminal justice and prosecution. And so when you see a George Soros come in on, I think, 12 races in 2016 and drop $1 million in 12 different districts, including one right here in Colorado, my neighboring judicial district, the place where I grew up, where I started as a prosecutor, what you see is the criminal justice reformers, and that term is far too forgiving. These are the life for killers crowd, the hugs for bad guys crowd. There are some ideas they have that are worth thinking about, but by and large, keep in mind, their goal is to diminish the consequences for some of the worst offenders in our community. And their goal is to try to get them to be on the same footing as you. If you've spent your life being law-abiding and not feeding your greed or your lust or your addiction, they want to put them in the same position that you are, despite their bad conduct. So this approach, you'll see this in 2020, Jimmy, right here in our state. In fact, my seat is going to be contested. We have one great Republican, a guy named John Kilner, Lieutenant Colonel in the Marine Corps and one of my chief deputies, who's going to be opposed by someone whose experience in criminal justice amounts to no more than, wait for it, a single DUI trial. And she would like to be the district attorney of this large judicial district dealing with dozens of murders every year, rapes, robberies, attempt murders. And it's not with an eye towards successful prosecution. It's with an eye towards, quote unquote, criminal justice reform. So this approach that politics has taken to pushing away prosecution and to trying to isolate them until they can get their political activist prosecutors in place. You see that in places like San Francisco. You see that in Philadelphia. Take a look at the Los Angeles race, right? You have a Democrat DA in Los Angeles. She is being primaried by an uber progressive DA who came from San Francisco, who carpet-bagged his way down to Los Angeles from San Francisco for the sole purpose of running against her and bringing a George Soros, let them all out of jail approach to criminal justice. We're seeing that everywhere.
George Brauchler, District Attorney for the 18th Judicial District, Colorado's largest. More than 1 million people, one of fewer than 40 jurisdictions around the country with that number. Appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you so much.
Buddy, thanks for having me on. I hope this was good. I hope the sound was good for you.
Hey, it was great for us. Sorry you couldn't hear it better, but
No worries.
Some days, that's just, you got to muddle your way through. Once again, George Brauchler joining us on Jimmy at the Crossroads.